What comes to mind when I say cowboy? You might picture John Wayne.
Go ahead and pull that rifle if you want to, but you better speak to your boss before you use it, because he'll be dead before I hit the ground.
Or Clint Eastwood.
You see, in this world, there's two kinds of people, my friend. Those with loaded guns, and those who dig. You dig.
Maybe even Kevin Costner.
We don't kill sheep, we kill wolves.
The cowboy is a symbol of the North American West, often depicted in popular culture as a glamorous or heroic figure. He's almost always depicted as white. But my guest today, Karina Vernon, is one of several researchers digging into myths of the Old West and finding that the cowboy's roots just might take us all the way to Western Africa. I'm Melissa Gismondi. Welcome to another episode of Humanities at Large from the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. Karina Vernon is an associate professor of English at the University of Toronto, but she grew up in rural Alberta, in a small town about 90 kilometers north of Calgary, a place where cowboy culture is strong. So if I went back in time and asked young Karina to draw me a picture of a cowboy, what would that picture look like?
Oh, what a great question. It would have been a young, able-bodied white man. And there would have been no question. There's no question that it wouldn't have been a woman. There's no question that the cowboy wouldn't have been black. That would not have been thinkable to me at the time.
So as a kid, as you were growing up, you once said that you sort of grew up feeling like an anomaly. Why is that? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I was born in Central America in Honduras, and my family moved to the prairies when I was about 9 years old. We first landed in Calgary, and then we moved to the small town of Olds. And I just didn't see any signs of blackness in my environment. There was no material sign or no even cultural representation of the region's Black history. And so I felt like my sister and I were the first Black people. I honestly thought this. I thought my sister and I were the first Black people to set foot on prairie soil. And there's a way in which I thought of us as pioneers. It's a feeling that really can misshape your identity if you don't think about yourself as belonging to a history. And so I've spent my research career kind of assembling that history and putting together that genealogy that actually I was a part of, even then, without knowing it.
Do you remember the moment when you learned that there were Black cowboys, not only in the US, but also in Canada? Was there a particular story or maybe a cowboy that you came across?
It must have been through the work of a wonderful Calgary writer and historian named Cheryl Fogo. She wrote a wonderful coming-of-age novel called Pouring Down Rain about growing up in the suburbs of Calgary in the 1960s. And what jumped out about the book for me is that Fogo herself writes about finding out that there were Black cowboys. And so there was this echo, she has written about and has made a documentary about going to the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, Glenbow Museum and Archives, and finding out from a display in the atrium there that there had been a Black cowboy named John Ware. And she ran home and told her brother there was a Black cowboy named John Ware. And he was like, no, what? This changes everything. And so I had the same experience, 30 years after she did. And it's an experience that keeps sort of echoing down the chain. This fact that there were Black cowboys still occupies the status of a surprise, despite the work that has been done to document the history I think the whitewashing of the cowboy story, the whitewashing of the West is so powerful that the fact of Black cowboys still sounds mythical, or still sounds like sci-fi or an alternate history of the West, but it's in fact, the idea that the cowboy was always white, that is a myth, and that is an alternate history of the West.
So you mentioned John Ware, this kind of famous Black cowboy here in Canada. Tell me a little bit about him.
Yeah, John Ware was born in Texas. I believe he was born into slavery and then saw the emancipation. And after the Civil War, most jobs were closed to Black men. So becoming a cowboy was one of the few ways Black men could make a living. So he joined the cattle drives up from Texas. And after 1880, when the Canadian government started lending land to American British families, and they started ranches in the Canadian West, what is currently Alberta and Saskatchewan. So after the 1880s, big ranching operations opened in Canada. And so people like John Ware started driving cattle up, past Wyoming, past Montana, and over the 49th parallel to Canada. And he stayed. Instead of returning back to Texas, he stayed, continued working as a cowboy, eventually established his own ranch, married, had children, and made himself extremely famous in his own time for his skill with cattle. He's credited with so-called inventing the sport of steer wrestling, which is celebrated every year at the Stampede, in Calgary Stampede. For a Black man in his time, so he arrived on the Canadian side of the border in 1880. And he became so well known that his funeral was one of the biggest ever attended in Calgary. His wedding announcement ran in the Calgary Herald. And his wife is an interesting person as well. Mildred Ware came from a middle-class family in the suburbs of Toronto. She's got her own interesting story. She didn't like horses. She was not suited to the cowboy life, but fell in love with apparently an extremely charming John Ware. And his story is interesting because although he's very well known and there are high schools named for him in Calgary, in a way his fame covers over the existence of the other Black cowboys. He's celebrated as kind of a singular man. Like he was the one and only Black cowboy, but in fact, he was part of a community, right? He was part of a whole generation of Black men who were cowboying and driving cattle up north and who were in and around southern Alberta at the time. So yeah, his story is kind of reveals and conceals something about the cowboy story.
So this broader community of Black cowboys that he was a part of, like how many exactly? How many are we talking? And what do we know about their other lives? Like we know about John Ware. How would their lives compare to his?
Well, we know that in Texas, when the state of Texas joined the Confederate States, 30% of the population was enslaved. And so after emancipation, 1 in 4, according to some historians, 1 in 4 cowboys was Black. So that's a significant population of Black cowboys. How many of those arrived on the Canadian side of that colonial border? I still don't know. We don't know the names of all of those Black folks. And as far as their lives, that's the interesting part to me, that their lives left few textual records. So do we have letters from them written back home to their sweethearts? Not really, as far as I know. Since many were born into slavery, I think few, like John Ware was not literate. So I've seen his signature on legal documents, and it's a sort of quite a shaky hand. So they didn't leave a lot of textual records. And archivists and historians, well, we love texts. That's the material that we usually work with. What I'm looking at right now is the other materials that they left, so-called materials, a lot more ephemeral. they left songs, so they sang about their lives. They composed songs on horseback. They sang about the conditions of their work. They sang about their relationships with their bosses, being swindled out of money by their bosses. They sang about loved ones, romantic relationships. They wrote about being tired. um, they wrote about their relationships with animals. I think that we can hear in their songs that they sang with their horses and to the environment. They were singing about and to those Western lands, those indigenous lands on Turtle Island. They sang about colonialism, indigenous people. They sang about anti-Black racism, and they thought about those two things together. So I think about those songs as a kind of Black autobiography about life in the post-emancipation period.
I was riding there daily, and I know I'm a poor cowboy, and I know I've done wrong. Go bring me my pony, let me ride up down him. Then at my doorbell, you got to be still. Well, a nigga time driving will be up your quarter, way out in the West Texas upon some hill.
The song you're hearing is called St. James Hospital, performed by Moses Clear Rock Platt. It was recorded by the musicologists John and Alan Lomax in a Texas prison in 1933. It's part of the Alan Lomax collection at the Library of Congress. You'll hear more recordings from their collections throughout the episode. The Lomax's preservation of African American folk music offers an important window into the lives of Black cowboys. But as Karina explains, it's also complicated.
Alan and John Lomax recorded this in a penitentiary, right? They figured, so they were making these recordings in the 1930s, and the cattle drives had largely ended by the 1880s in the US. And so they thought to themselves, where can we get really authentic cowboy songs? If we go and record men who have spent the last 40 years in a penitentiary, segregated from the rest of society, that's where we're going to get the authentic songs. So that's what they did. And Clear Rock Moses Platt himself had never been a cowboy. But you can hear in the song that he had heard cowboy songs. At the end there, you can hear the cattle calls, the whooping sound that cowboys would use to kind of giddy up the cattle that they were driving. So he was part of the culture, and he was certainly old enough to remember them. He was 70 years old when that recording was taken. But what I think that you can hear in that recording is a hybrid cowboy song / prison song. When I first heard it, I was struck by a line in it. I'm a poor cowboy, I think he says, and I know I done wrong. And I was like, wait a second, I haven't heard cowboy songs that have that kind of humble, sort of repentant type of lyric in it. So I think that what we're hearing, and I have to do more research on this, but I think what we're hearing there is Clear Rock Platt hybridizing a traditional cowboy song with something of his own experience in that Texas prison.
Which is, I guess, kind of how culture works, right? You soak it up, you digest it, and then you kind of often put your own twist. You put you see it through the lens of your own experience.
Absolutely. The Lomaxes, as musicologists, wanted to record songs out of time, right? Mm-hmm. They thought by going to prison, they would find a population that was out of time, outside of the culture. And yeah, you're right. That's not how music works. Music doesn't stand still. And I think Moses Platt was an incredible artist, and he, in a way, smuggled something of his own experience into the song.
So you were mentioning, this that often quote unquote literature scholars or historians are obsessed with, we're obsessed with text, like what has been written down, what has been, but that shifting to something, like songs or other kinds of form of culture. You've talked about how this is sort of leaving the surface world of the archive and
Right.
moving into this underground realm of oral tradition. Talk a bit more about sort of what possibilities this new method has sort of opened up for you.
The archive is a tricky space for historians of Black people's lives. On the one hand, there are records that exist that we can piece together to tell the story of Black folks dispersed onto Turtle Island. But when the archive is the only institution to tell the story, Black lives are kind of overdetermined as a story of lack, like the lack of documents or the fragility of the history is also then becomes part of the story. So there's something exhilarating about moving away from the archive. Exhilarating in both senses of the word, like it's a bit scary, for someone trained to read literature, to read texts, and to make meaning out of text. But the history is so much bigger than the archive can contain. Something else is possible when we think about the ways that history has been mattered on the prairies in other ways, like in songs, even in things like seeds and fleshy bodies like horses and cattle. So, in what other ways on this continent can we read and piece together the history of Black folks? And then we can write it in more positive terms. We can think about it in more positive terms. Yeah.
And is songs the thing that connects the dots? Because you were saying earlier, cowboys sang to their horses and in relation to their environment. So is that the thread that connects us to also the plants around them, the ecology that they're seeing, the animals they're engaging with? Is that sort of the through line?
That's the through line that I'm following.
Hmm.
um, as a scholar trained in Canadian literature studies, at first I began looking for Black cowboys of the Canadian prairies and thinking about their oral cultures. But right away, like I mentioned with John Ware is connected with Texas. So I had to leave the Canadian space and follow him to Texas. And then there's a rich cowboy song culture in and around Texas, and a song culture that follows the cattle trail, the Chisholm Trail, north from Texas to Oklahoma, Kansas, and then over the Canadian border. And then that song culture, I believe, takes us to the story of the arrival of Black folks on the continent in the first place. So I'm discovering that cattle aren't indigenous in the Americas. In reading agrarian science and connecting with scientists that are doing research on ancient DNA of cattle, I'm discovering that the cattle species in the Americas is connected to cattle species on the west coast of Africa in Senegambia. And that takes me in tugging this rope all the way back to Senegambia in the 16th century, when people and cattle started coming across the Atlantic as part of the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th century.
I feel like that must have been, I mean, I don't know that I've ever heard cattle connected to the slave trade in that way. Were you surprised when you learned about that discovery of the ancient DNA with North American cattle with those connections to West Africa?
I was shook because, we began the conversation talking about me growing up in Alberta. And of course, it's not only cowboys, but of course, cattle that are intrinsic to the prairies self-identity. And of course, I thought that cattle and cowboys are indigenous to this space. The culture celebrates them that way. You know, it was only last year when I turned the CBC radio, and I turned on Quirks and Quarks because I love listening to science programs. And I happened to hear an interview with Nicholas Del Sol, who is the scientist performing this DNA research on cattle. And he was talking about realizing from the DNA of cattle that cattle arrived in North America through the slave trade. And I was like, so wait a second. Are you telling me that the whole story of the cowboy, the Calgary Stampede, etc., is actually celebrating figures and species that are African in origin? Is that what I'm hearing? It is what I'm hearing. You know, according to this research, the first cowboys in the Americas were African, right? You know, they were brought over deliberately. They were targeted by slave traders for their knowledge of working with cattle species, because in Senegambia, they had this millennia-long culture of working with domesticated cattle. So when I realized that the first cowboys, and that's the wrong term, cowboys is, that term comes from an African-American context where African-American men were called boys who worked with cattle, right? So that derogatory legacy from the slavery times is built into the terminology. But when I realized that the cowboy figure predated even the United States as a country, well, that changed the whole story for me. And so that's where my imagination is right now.
So fortuitous that you just switched on the radio.
Oh my God. All of my research depends on serendipity, being at the right place at the right time.
Well, I want to bring it back a little bit to songs. And you mentioned earlier, you know, we were talking about cattle and the roots of cattle. And you mentioned that often the songs that cowboys sang, they were singing to their cattle.
Right.
Tell me a bit about their job as cowboys and how that inspired some of the songs that they were singing.
So when cowboys were driving cattle out of Texas, and they were driving the cattle out of Texas because Texas grass was dry and shrubby, and they wanted to fatten their cattle for market. So they would drive these huge herds, we're talking about 1,000 head herd of cattle, up to literally greener pastures, to the lusher grasses of Kansas and Oklahoma. Now, that was an open prairie, meaning that the prairie wasn't fenced by anything like barbed wire. Barbed wire hadn't been invented yet. And so on that open prairie, if cattle stampeded for any reason, that cattle was long gone in the night. So if there were thunderstorms, if there were coyote, wolves, grizzly bears, anything like that, sudden noises, if the cattle were nervous, they were gone and the cowboys couldn't get them back. And that was money lost. So oftentimes the black cowboys especially were relegated to the job of the overnight shift. After the cattle were bedded down for the night, the black cowboys were nightingale night herds. That's what they were called. And it was their job to ride around and around the herd. They worked in twos, one riding clockwise and the other one riding counterclockwise around the herd. And they would sing songs to calm the cattle. And those were lullabies. And that's the origin of cowboy music, actually. Lullabies to calm the cattle.
That's beautiful. I love that.
I know.
I thought I would be riding up saddle and a hoop died in lumley, yeah, hoop died in lumley. Went out riding and I got saddle and the mule on the right back up on the saddle and a hoop died in lumley, yeah, hoop died in lumley. Let me tell you about Santa Hill, they told me right on the foot of the hill and a hoop died in lumley, yeah, and the bum died in lumley. Woo.
That was Moses Clear Rock Platt singing the traditional cowboy song, The Old Chisholm Trail, in 1933. It's a song born on the cattle drives that brought black cowboys to the Canadian prairies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These cowboys were usually hired by large ranching operations to drive the cattle north. But then African American farmers started moving to the Canadian prairies to set up their own ranches. I asked Karina why they came.
Around 1910, they came for the land that had been recently stolen, expropriated from Indigenous people during the process of the treaty negotiations. The number of treaties were signed in Canada. And so the federal government was selling off Indigenous people's land, and they were inviting American farmers to come up north. And the Canadian government advertised in American newspapers. Accidentally, they ran ads in African American newspapers to inviting.
Did they not know that they were
They did
doing?
not know. They did not know. They said for $10 fee, you could get 160 acres.
Wow.
And so African Americans were like, okay, let's go. The Canadian government didn't mention any racial restrictions because they didn't anticipate that African Americans would read this. And so that set up a huge chain of migration to the Canadian prairies.
So earlier we were talking about the sort of whitewashing that goes on with this history and also the culture, right? You were saying actually it's the idea of the white cowboy that is a myth in a way because it wasn't exclusively that. And I think this is a binary that we really see with the violent and racist imagery of cowboys and Indians, which is all over Hollywood. I'm wondering how you've sort of been thinking about that narrative, of the binary of the cowboys and Indians in relation to the figure of the black cowboy that sort of moves between and just kind of interrupts that binary.
That's a great question. Yeah, of course, the West was never only white and Indigenous, right? The Hollywood has taken the story of the cowboy and identified the figure of the cowboy with the nation and this kind of story about the quest for the West. The opening up the West was sort of the story of the American nation territorializing on all that Indigenous land, on all that stolen Indigenous land. The story becomes a lot more complicated when you realize that the cowboy figure also included black cowboys. That's a hard story, and some of the songs kind of work through that complicated history where black people and Indigenous people actively being displaced at the time were occupying the same space, and black people were witnessing that song, Home on the Range. We think about that song as kind of the settler colonial song par excellence, and it's been adopted as the national anthem of the American West.
Where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play.
But when you imagine that the perspective is actually a black singer, that black singer is witnessing the displacement of Indigenous people. The song is about testifying to that and being part of the same context, but also held apart, right? Not able to sort of reach out toward each other in that moment and organize against colonialism, the afterlives of slavery, against white supremacy.
And the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not
So it's sorrowful, really sorrowful. When I think about Black cowboys driving cattle northward, so this non-Indigenous species, along with the displacement of Indigenous people that made these cattle drives possible in the first place, was also the near annihilation of the buffalo. And so one of the things that those cowboys and Black cowboys were involved in was kind of replacing one species for another, right? And so the ironies upon ironies of that history just resound with me. That Black people were caught up in, what ultimately was a settler colonial project. It's still a history that I'm, as you can hear in my voice, that I'm still grappling with, and that is still painful to think about. Yeah.
I'm curious what you think sort of gets lost if, the stories, the histories we've been talking about today, the songs, what gets lost if these stay underground? Like what do we lose out on?
To go back to the beginning of our conversation, when I think about what my image of a cowboy was when I was growing up, if we don't resurface these stories, you fundamentally are robbed of the history of your own place, right? And your place within that place. So if we don't know the story of the Black cowboys and we don't know their musical cultures, then we don't know the story of our place. We don't know the story of Canada. We don't know the way that Canada is deeply connected to places like Texas, that is in turn connected to West Africa. Black folks don't know that country music and cowboy songs are ours, right? We don't know that legacy is part of our history, is part of our invention. We lose our kinships, right? We lose our kinship relationships with our traditions, with our other than human species. We lose our records of our attachments to land, right? We inherit the lie that we aren't part of this land. We inherit the lie that we don't have 400 years of connection to lands on Turtle Island, however complicated those connections are. And we also lose the incentive to keep looking in unexpected places for traces of our history. And I've been talking about Black folks, but I would say that the same goes for everybody. We want to see what history looks like from the underground. There are all kinds of ways that history has been preserved, and we want our histories enriched and broadened by seeing how else history has been mattered.
So you mentioned, the hypothetical drawing of the cowboy when you were young, and I know you talked about sort of feeling like, you and your sister were maybe the first, Black kids in this part of, Alberta and the prairies. But I'm wondering sort of how you feel, or if you feel any differently now about your roots in the prairies, now having done, a lot of this research and starting to look into it.
Yeah, this research has been transformative for me in every way possible. I found a language for my experience. I can now say, for instance, Black prairies, and I kind of claim that as an identity. I'm a Black prairie person. I can claim a genealogy that I belong to, a long history, and that makes a difference. I claim a community now. I know, like John Ware wasn't alone in his moment, I know that my experience belongs to this common history. Instead of an I, there's a we, and that itself is transformative. I find echoes when I'm reading about the cowboys and I'm listening to their songs. I feel a closeness and a kinship with them. There's ways that they belong in complicated ways to that land that I feel a connection to.
I think that is a great place to end, but I want to ask, in case we didn't get at anything that you think is really important or anything else you would add to any of what we talked about.
I loved your questions. Thanks for offering me an opportunity to unspool my thinking. This is all sort of brand new research, and I'm just sort of, as you can hear in my answers, I'm just kind of like thinking my way through it.
No, thank you. And I realize as you yourself and others are still sort of thinking through, which I realize requires a little bit, maybe a lot of courage to say, but I'm going to go out there and be public with my thinking, which is
Aw.
usually academics, right? We wait till here's my article that's been published. And so I appreciate that you're willing to sort of be open with the thinking and the process.
I guess I'm keen to share this stuff because I love these Black cowboys. I love them. They're not me, but it's amazing to me that they left a trace of their experience in the song, and that 100 years later, almost, I get to hear them. You know, that's amazing to me.
Karina Vernon is Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto's Scarborough campus. She was a JHI Faculty Research Fellow from 2024 to 2025. The music you heard in this episode was Home on the Range, performed by James Richardson from the collection John and Ruby Lomax's 1939 Southern States Recording Trip at the Library of Congress. The lyrics were written by Brewster M. Higley, and the music by Daniel E. Kelly. The Old Chisholm Trail and St. James Hospital were performed by Moses Clearrock Platt. They're from the Alan Lomax collection at the Library of Congress and available on the album Black Texicans, Balladeers and Songsters of the Texas Frontier. You'll find links to these sources in the podcast description. Humanities at Large is produced by the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with a friend or colleague, and be sure to hit the follow button so you never miss an episode. I'm Melissa Gismondi, and I'll be back again in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening.